Hello there, physics teachers. Welcome to this first training video in our scope and sequence curriculum map and all of that stuff. This will be a 4 or 5 part series taking you through things I've created for this new school year. What you should find is things look new, but they also look the same. Not much has changed in terms of what's being taught throughout the year, but more of the look and the support that's provided for all of these resources. So hopefully you guys will see that there's a bit more usefulness in the scope and sequence, curriculum maps, and now pace and guide. How about that? I haven't had that one before. And we'll talk through how I envision these things being used. So let's go ahead and dive into that. Let me share my screen. And this first video is on the new scope and sequence. Now, if you were like me, getting older, vision's not what it was, you look at this document, you're like, oh, that is some small font. And that is true. I was trying to make these a one-pager scope and sequence, which I did. When you're looking at it digitally, it's totally fine because you can always zoom in, right? You can say, okay, well, now I can see. It's just you got to scroll around. I thought about this for teachers though, and when you print it out, it is incredibly small. So I thought about that and I created a different version that's 2 pages. So when you print it out, it's still one paper, front and back. And if you want to access that, double click this picture up here and you'll see the link for it pop up here. And so that's the one I'm going to use just because it's a little bit larger. And I printed these out for my own notebooks because it's a little bit easier to see, fits better. So hopefully you find this useful. So I'll use this one in this video, but it's the exact same as the other one. The only difference is it goes on for a second page. So semester 1 is on page 1, semester 2, page 2. Nothing crazy there. So let's just kind of walk our way through this. Everything that was in the old scope and sequence is here in this one. Really, I was trying to do a couple things. One, I matched the style that math uses for theirs. So our instructional coach and principals, they're going to be seeing the same format, and so it's going to look familiar. Second, I was really going for that one page, and it's like the whole year at a glance with a lot of information. How I see this being used, it's not part of your daily, your weekly lesson planning, but kind of get an idea in your head for one, the topics that are being covered in the various parts. So I can see, okay, first semester, we're talking about motion, forces, energy and systems, waves and lights. I can kind of prepare myself for that, and also take a look at the suggested pacing and kind of gauge, all right, where am I at in this pacing? Now this is kind of suggested, so it's not like saying you have to be here. I understand some people will move through these things quickly, you'll be ahead. Some people will take more time, you'll be behind. Those that are ahead, that tells you, hey, why don't you spend a little bit more time, dive in deep into a topic. Those that are behind, look ahead. What are some of the topics that you can cut out that aren't as important? And you'll have to decide that on your own. So that's kind of what the suggested pacing is. And I'll even cover like this first one. It says the first 5 weeks. And yet when you dive into this, there's more than 5 weeks worth of material. So you're either going to be cutting out some of this, bleeding into here. But I've thought about that in terms of testing. So just hold with me for a little bit. So you got your quarter breakdowns up at the top, suggested pacing, we've talked about that. And then you get your actual units and their titles. If you actually click on this, that's how you'll access the curriculum maps. If you're on the district website, there'll also be links to this there. We have a science website, there'll be links to this there. I'm sure I'll be emailing links all throughout the year. So hopefully getting access to this easy, but the scope and sequence, you can access every curriculum map from here. So that is incredibly useful. The guiding questions for each unit, we've got, I think I did 2 for everyone. Oh, we got 3 in that one. What are the guiding questions driving the discussions in this topic? And what I really view these for is I need to think about these at the beginning, and then by the end, students should be able to answer these. So like when you're looking at the first few lessons, it's like, what is motion? How do scientists describe motion? What's evidence of motion? Acceleration, velocity, you got all that sort of thing. And then we start to get into energy and ways it can be used to explain motion. So these essential questions are really good for framing what are we trying to get the kids to answer to. When you really break these down, you start to see the topics and the vocabulary that you need to be building into the classroom vocabulary discussions and sort of that thing. Moving down to proficiency scales, if you use these in the past, you find them useful, they're still here. This was a project done by my predecessor. They can be very useful. Let's go ahead and just look at one for anybody who hasn't seen these. The idea behind these is it's sort of a model for getting to standards-based grading. But you can also look at it as the skills and practices that students are learning as they move towards mastery. So then these would be students that have mastered it should be able to do these. And then you also have like my above and beyond students are reaching here. So that's kind of how that can be used. You might find some good help from that. It's not my document. I'm not going to mess with them, but they are still around. So if you found those useful, still there. The standard alignment. So which standards go with each unit. Now, obviously, some things might crop back up in other units. So that's totally fine, totally normal. We do want science to feel connected. But I've also got linked here straight to the, if you're that type of person that loves looking at the standard, the breakdown, the cross-cutting concepts, all that sort of stuff, I've got it here as a PDF, so you don't have to go and see it's just for this standard. Typically, when you go to Destin, you find this, it's in that long document. So you're trying to find the one standard. These are all linked just to their standard. So that's going to help really focus in on if you're trying to break down one standard. So hopefully you find those useful if you want to dive into all this stuff, look at the possible evidence on all that sort of material. Moving on down, investigations. So these are what the CPO, Physics First, what they call their labs as investigations. And I doubt we'll do every single one because there's 3 per chapter and there's quite a few chapters. You're not going to get to every investigation, but, and I'll cover this later, you will have support and all the materials for doing these. And we're trying to give our students hands-on experience or at least demonstrations for some of them. So that way students see things in the real world and experience it. So just so that the investigations are easy to access here on the scope and sequence, they're also very easy to access once we get to the curriculum map. I do have them all listed here. So you've got your 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. They give you 2 different versions of these. You got the print version that I call, and all the print version is you would print this out because it's got the lines for students. You also have a version where if you're assigning it online, it has these boxes. It's not in this view, but if I were to download it, you can actually type in these fields. These are text fields. So you could assign it and students could type in theoretically on these, just in those text box. So it gives you those options. Or if you just want to preview them, again, you'll have these tied more specifically in the curriculum map with where those are. But I thought just in terms of kind of overall planning, if you want to look at what are the labs in the various chapters, you can preview them. And then finally, you got the assessments down here. Each chapter has a test that's associated with it. And I'm pretty sure they're all multiple choice. And so this year we're moving away from in-room tests. And we're moving into, it's either going to be called unit test or quarter test. Either way, it's at the end of the quarter. Now, what's different for you guys is you actually have 2 units in the quarter. So that's why I'm not probably going to call it a unit test. It's a quarter test. You'll be testing here. So your test will cover unit 1, unit 2. So I pulled questions from these chapter tests for this quarter test. And that's so that when you're using the resources, you're preparing the students to be successful on those. One note about that, because I talked about pacing earlier, I was like, oh, it's going to be kind of tight to get all this in right here because there's quite a bit here. So I know from previous years, we were always running a bit behind. So for the quarter test, I tried to skew the questions heavier on this end of things as opposed to like the end of chapter 6. So chapter 6, I tried to pull the least amount of questions from, and the other chapters I pulled more from. Chapter 1 is kind of like the basics, so not a lot from there. So most of your questions were coming from 2 to 5. And so that should help everybody be able to cover all the content. And then as you are running out of time, as we get to the end of the quarter, now you can really focus in and say, okay, what part of chapter 6 do I need to focus on to make sure my students are successful? So hopefully you guys view that as useful. You'll have access to that quarter test at the start of the year. You guys can give me feedback. You can review the questions. I pulled them all from here. So that way it's things that students are seeing as you teach in your classroom. The other thing that's great about having these chapter tests here available is I would preview these before you jump into a unit. So that way you can start to view the questions. What are the topics that are being covered? What are the, I didn't think I was recording for a second. What are the topics? What's the vocabulary? What things come up a lot? And what that's going to help you do is really plan how you can focus in your instructions on the specific questions that are tested here and on my quarter test. So I phrase this as we want to teach towards the test. We don't want to go in blind and the students see questions they've never heard about before, but we don't want to teach to the test. We're not sitting there and saying, when you see a question like this, answer with that. No, we want to be informed about what we're going to assess our students on. So that way we set them up for success is the idea there. So hopefully having those easily available here as you kind of planning out a year is useful. All of this stuff, even though it's here on the scope and sequence, you will also find in the curriculum map where it's in the order. But this is kind of your, let me think broad, what's going on in the big picture. And that's how I view this. So you don't have to use this all the time to access all these documents. You'll find them linked more specifically in the curriculum map, which we'll cover in the next video. I want to keep these not too long. So let's kind of wrap it up there. Hopefully you found that useful for that new look of the scope and sequence. Would love your guys' feedback on all this stuff. So yeah, this is growing. We're going to work together to build this thing out. And for now, we're really focused on what are the things from the resource that we can use. Because in the past, there was no support for that. And so we weren't using the resource at all. So starting with what's in the resource, how can we use it? And then I know you guys have other resources that you like to use. And then we can start to blend those things into it as well. And then we'll have a really, really good looking curriculum. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one.